Welcome to the February 18, 2014 meeting of the Downers Grove Village Council. It is my privilege to call this meeting to order. There are copies of our agenda on either side of the room. If you haven't already done so, please feel free to pick up a copy and follow along with our meeting tonight. I think we have enough copies, but I'm not sure. We might have to check. It is our custom and honor to begin our meetings by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. So at this point, I would invite everyone to please stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance along with us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. I would now like to ask our fine village clerk, April Holden, to please call the roll.
Commissioner Jose?
Here.
Commissioner Olson?
Here.
Commissioner Rankin? Here. Commissioner Barnett? Commissioner Neustadt?
Here.
Commissioner Durkin?
Here.
Mayor Tully?
Here. Thank you very much. Brings us to item 3 on our agenda, minutes of prior council meetings. We have one set of minutes to review and approve tonight. Those are our meeting minutes from our February 11, 2014 regular council meeting. Are there any changes, questions, comments, or corrections to those minutes from any members of the village council? Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve, please?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? None? No abstentions?
No.
All right, those minutes are approved. Thank you. It brings us to item 4, public comments. This is a portion of the meeting where we invite members of the audience to please come up and share with us any questions or comments of a general nature with respect to items not appearing on tonight's agenda. There will be opportunities for public comment on the items that are on our agenda tonight. But if any members of the audience have any questions or comments of a general nature at this point, please come down to the podium, give us your name and address, and we would welcome hearing from you. Are there any questions or comments of a general nature this evening? Hearing none. We'll move to item 5. Council member reports. This segment of the meeting we reserve for council members to report out on various goings on in the community. And tonight we will start to my far right. Commissioner Jose.
I have no report, Mayor. Thank you.
Commissioner Rankin.
No report, thank you.
Commissioner Durkin.
I have no report.
Commissioner Olson.
No report.
Commissioner Neustadt.
I have a report. It's a little earlier than I told the kids I was going to say it, but today I was lucky enough to attend Fairmount School in the 3rd grade class of Mrs. Swallows and Mrs. Pope. They're in the middle of a civics and or what does our community do lesson. So they invited me in to talk a little bit about what we do up here in the village council, as well as what our village does. And if you can believe it or not, the kids had a lot of great questions, including questions about our foul ordinance. We talked a lot about the police and fire departments and public works and water delivery, snow plowing. We even talked about the zoning ordinance, if you can believe that. They were interested in what we were doing tonight, so I told them we were talking about that and that we were buying 7 cars. And they were very interested in the purchase of 7 cars at one time. So it was great to spend some time with the class today. Thank you for letting me come into your classroom. And maybe we'll see you again around school. Thank you.
Terrific. And when will Mr. Dave Reiner be visiting the school? I mean, I told you about those 1.5 continuing education credits in urban planning. I think that could be part of the STEM curriculum here in Nashville. Thank you, Commissioner. The only thing I will mention as part of my report is I just want to thank Pierce Downer Elementary School. Commissioner Neustadt, Manager Fieldman, and I were there today. There was an opening of a time capsule that had been embedded in the wall of Pierce Downer since February 18th, 1994. And I'm pleased to report that unlike Geraldo Rivera's experience with Al Capone's vault, there were actually items behind the wall and in the time capsule. It was very, very carefully and professionally removed by none other than the gentleman to my left. And the contents were displayed by Principal Sissel to the whole body. And it was pretty neat to see what the kids had put into the time capsule back in 1994. I think pretty much most of the audience wasn't born in 1994. So a lot of good memories were shared, and I think it was a good educational experience for all the kids. And just wanted to thank District 58 and Pierce Downer School for inviting us out. I think it was pretty interesting. Where did 20 years go? We'll see what they put in for the next time capsule, which will be open 20 years henceforth. Commissioner Durkin.
I saw that on Facebook, but nobody really elaborated on the post what the items were that were put in there. Can you share what some of the items were?
I can.
CD?
There's
Walkman or?
There is a video.
Oh, there is?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That will be put on later on Facebook. The contents included.
Suspense.
Well,
must be ratings series or something.
That's right. You got to tease these things
We'll
out.
give Jimmy Fallon a run for his money.
A number of the items we had were things that were prepared by the kids. So, for example, there were different, all the kids had their handprints with their names and favorite sports stars and favorite movies and things like that. So when you saw the sports stars, as you can imagine, in 1994, there were a lot of members of the Chicago Bulls that were listed at that time. And the movies were things like Jurassic Park.
Okay.
A lot of things that were out at the time. Different essays were written by the children. There were materials that had been prepared by various classrooms that were in there. There were two items that were strangely rectangular that looked like thin bricks, and nobody knew what they were. They had markings on them. Nobody knew what they were. Somebody then finally said, there was some historian in the back of the room that said they were VHS tapes.
Oh, I thought we were going to go to the
As
beta.
soon as we figure out what that is, well, kids had never seen a VHS tape.
Who has one?
And a few other items in there, but it was a neat learning experience.
Cool.
And then we got to talk a little bit about the history of Pierce Downer and the history of Downers Grove a wee bit. And there were some students who had been there at the time who came back, and there were some teachers who were there in 1994 and they came back. It was a very nice ceremony.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
So next year on the high priority action items, we'll have to have a village council time capsule.
So a lot of people were working here in 1994, so that
Very good. Thank you. Then we'll move on to item 6 on our agenda, which is reserved for public hearings. We have no public hearings tonight, so we'll move to our consent agenda. Are there any motions with respect to the consent agenda?
I believe item E has been requested to be removed from the consent agenda. Correct.
Is there a motion to remove item E from the consent? Oh, that's right. We don't have to do that anymore. I keep forgetting
Automatic removal.
because I'm back in 1994. I'm sorry. Item E of the consent agenda, that would be item 7E, for those of you scoring at home, has been removed from the consent agenda at the request of the council member. One of these days I'll get used to that. Just old habits die hard. With that item removed, is there a motion to adopt the consent agenda as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Are there any questions or comments from any members of the audience with respect to any of the items on the consent agenda or items removed from the consent agenda? Hearing none, any questions or comments from members of the village council? Roll call, please.
Commissioner Neustadt?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye. The modified consent agenda passes unanimously. It brings us to item 8, our active agenda. We have nothing on our active agenda tonight.
We need to consider item E that was just removed from the consent agenda. I think Commissioner Durkin may have a motion on that.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. We actually, now we need to treat, yes. Sorry. Time out. The whole time travel thing got me completely thrown out of whack. All right, let's start this again. Take 2. Is there a motion to authorize a bid for approximately $200,000 for the purchase of 7 replacement vehicles?
Mayor Tully, I motion to table for consideration to the next council meeting, first week of March.
Second.
There's a motion to table this to a date certain as specified by Commissioner Durkin. Any questions or comments from any members of the audience? Questions or comments from members of the village council?
Procedurally, do we need to have a motion to adopt it before we can table it, or no?
Motion to table. is-
Yeah, that's fine.
Roll call, please.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Neustadt?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye. Matter, item E, that we removed from the consent agenda, has been tabled to a date certain, which is our next regular council meeting in March.
Correct.
March 4th.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. All right, now, we move to the active agenda, and there are no other items on the active agenda. We'll move to item 9, which is our first reading or our workshop agenda, where we discuss items that are presented for consideration by the council and action at a future point in time. It's customary to turn over presentation of the items to the village manager and his staff. Manager Fieldman, please.
Thank you, Mayor Tully. There are 2 items on tonight's first reading agenda. The first is consideration of an ordinance amending Chapter 14 regarding parking. And here to present this item is our performance manager, Allison Deitch.
Good evening. Good evening. This parking ordinance, has 2 items of significance and some housekeeping items. The first part is to a proposal to create a new reverse commuter parking permit to serve commuters reaching Downers Grove by Metra. The permit would be valid on level 2 of the parking deck from 3 p.m. to 9 a.m. during the week and on weekends, taking advantage of the off-peak hours in the deck and freeing up existing overnight parking in the deck for downtown residents for whom it was intended. And these permits would be priced at the same price as non-resident commuter permits. The second part of the ordinance is to remove the start time for the sale of daily parking permits, which are currently sold beginning at 8:15 at the Village Hall and Public Works for use in the permit lots. Staff is concerned that the 8:15 sales encourage commuters to rush to find a parking spot for the 8:17 express train, displacing permit holders and creating a safety concern. This change would allow staff to have the discretion to determine this time to sell permits to prevent this safety concern. And staff would notify the regular permit buyers before making the change. And finally, this ordinance has some housekeeping items. It clarifies Lot L parking and removes language regarding the cash key system, which is no longer sold by the village. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. First, any questions from any members of the audience with respect to this item, proposed ordinance change? Questions from members of the Village Council? Commissioner Jose?
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry for not getting this in earlier. I'm curious if we have an expected number of these reverse commuting permits. Do we expect to sell the full limit of 20, or do we think it'll be a smaller number?
We currently have 13 reverse commuters that we know are have the parking permits that we offer now. So we would expect those people to buy the reverse commuter parking permits. So not the whole 20 at first, but we're not sure.
Thanks. That's all I have, Mayor. Thanks.
And I think ideally, we'd like to have more and more as time goes on, because that means we're attracting more people to Downers Grove for
Absolutely.
various reasons that are to our benefit. So once the word gets out, it's successful, I think we'd like to see that grow. Commissioner Durkin?
Just out of curiosity, the fee is going to be based on the non-resident commuter permit. What happens if it's a resident? Would they be able to get, would we have a two-tier pricing, or why are we going with the
Well,
higher? I'm guessing
right.
the non-resident is higher than the resident.
We would just anticipate that the users for this particular permit would be from outside Downers Grove, but certainly if they were commuting for some other reason, then we could offer them the resident rate.
If they are residents and looking for parking, it's probably more aligned with the Lot R permit. Which
Okay.
is what it's designed for. So they would get that pricing.
Oh, okay, great. I see that you're going to have, the manager's going to have discretion on numbers and stuff, so I'm sure that's something that you could easily handle. So that's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? I have none. Thank you for the presentation.
Thanks, Allison. And the next item is the, I believe, fourth and perhaps last installment of the presentation of the proposed changes to the zoning ordinance. And here again is our Community Development Director, Tom DeBreiner.
Good evening, Mr. Dave Reiner, and like mini-series, I understand you'll be going on hiatus after tonight. And this is the mid-season finale, and then we'll all have to wait until the fall.
This is where JR gets shot.
I think that's going back even farther, 1994.
I think it is, yes.
Well, it depends. Dallas, too?
Mayor, I don't get that one.
You were scratching your head with the VHS reference.
capsule. That goes in the time capsule.
I think I'll just jump into the presentation. This is focused tonight on some of the additional regulations and nonconformity sections of the proposed zoning ordinance. And for those of you following along, January 14th, we discussed the first group of articles within the zoning ordinance focusing on administration and process. And then a week later, we talked about some of the districts and the uses for those districts. And tonight, we're going to focus, like I said, on regulations and nonconformities. And this slide includes the goals. I won't repeat those. But there we are. In the blue, you can see what we've already covered, and we're going to work through the articles shown in yellow tonight. And, of course, we'll be following the notable changes presented in the concordance drawn up earlier this year. The first section, the first Article 7 deals with parking, and typically I would give you the proposal and then the reason why, but I think on this first item, this first row, I want to talk a little bit about the reason why first. The comprehensive plan process really discussed obviously a whole range of things, and this was one of them, and it focused on really preventing excess unused pavement, parking, and there are a number of examples around the community, and I'm going to spend about 15 minutes with photographs. I'm kidding. I always like to get the look from the mayor on that.
It's
Like,
only
what?
7:15.
So, no, you know, and there are some really good reasons for that. First of all, it does help to reduce some development costs, it reduces runoff impacts, provides the opportunity for more landscaping, and you know, there are other reasons as well. But the items then that are in the center column under proposal are the ones that I wanted to focus on with regard to this goal. And it includes a new maximum parking ratio. It doesn't eliminate parking, it doesn't flatline once you get above a certain level, it actually just reduces the rate. And that really comes out of best practices. We know that that first bulk of parking is what gets used, and after that it starts to trail off in terms of the rate, and that's what this is trying to recognize. It doesn't mean that a business who comes in who really needs more parking can't get it. It means that they can provide a study that shows, look, this is what we really need, and then we go through that process of approving that as part of a special use process, for example. In addition to a maximum parking ratio, we did reduce a number of the parking ratios that we required in the past. And really, I wanted to just draw your attention to this green book. It's published by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and it's entitled Parking Generation. And it provides really just hundreds of studies on different kinds of uses, and some of the parking ratios that then are analyzed and compared for different kinds of locations and the like. So it's really a pretty handy book, and it was relied on to help reduce some of the parking ratios that we have. And again, that's towards reducing the excess of pavement that we sometimes find in parking lots. And then a third item in this category is, oh, wait a minute, where, you might ask? Well, for example, restaurants, banks, offices, large grocery stores, daycare. There were a handful of others as well, and I just wanted to bring those to your attention. A third item in this category is shared parking. Shared parking is something that's really recognized worldwide at this point, and this reflects the need to modernize our ordinance. And in a shared parking example, you might have a shopping center, let's say, and somebody parks a car and goes into one use, a clothing store, let's say, and then they go into a grocery store in the same center. They're not necessarily moving their car, they don't need extra parking spaces, it's the same car, and the shared parking concept really takes that into account and helps to reduce the amount of parking that you might need in any given location. So those are really the three major ways that we're looking at addressing this concern and goal. The next row really talks about a number of different ways to support some alternatives to use of an automobile. Things like motorcycles, car share opportunities, bicycle parking, pedestrian enhancements to the pedestrian connections, you know, that is sidewalks from the door to the sidewalk as opposed to just the door to the parking lot. And this provides some opportunities. This is, again, as a modernization technique really here that we need to look at. It means that somebody building parking spaces might be able to include one or two for motorcycles where they could essentially double park in those spaces, thereby reducing the parking space count by one or two. And really it's limited to 5% of the parking count, the needed parking count, so it's not excessive at all. Similarly, for car share opportunities, car share by their nature, they're carrying more than one person, gives an opportunity to reduce parking supply. Bicycle parking really doesn't do the same thing. It's just an option, really. It is required in some locations now, and it's pretty commonly required in other communities as well. And then finally, I already mentioned the need to improve the connection between the front door of a business and the sidewalk. This is an improvement for pedestrians, transit users, and the like. It's not atypical to simply have that sidewalk reach out to a parking lot and forget about somebody who might be walking along the street side. So that's really what that is getting at. We did have the explicit goal of improving off-street parking, make sure that it matches better some of the land uses and those demands, as well as providing safe and convenient options. Unless there are questions, I'd move on to Article 8.
Any questions on Article 7?
Well, I kind of had a question. I understand that the parking is based on that book that has lots of studies. But for example, in the park category, it says 5 spaces per acre. So is that something that would be optional? Like some parks are neighborhood parks where they're probably designed for people to walk to. They might be smaller parcels of land. And then to require parking, I mean, is that something we would work with the park district on, or, you know, depending on?
Oh my gosh, yeah, we would absolutely work with whoever was in possession of the park or the land proposed to be a park. But that's a perfect example where we need these guidelines really for everyone to kind of measure, you know, high or low, or, you know, what is the target for parking. And that depends very much on the nature of that park, whether it's an active park or a passive recreational type facility. So this parking ratios very much are a starting point for discussions and usually help to provide a good target for everybody.
Okay.
That's where that, so that's a good example to bring up where in fact there is a good amount of variation.
Okay. And then my other question, which I had mentioned to Dave, is, and I know we're going to talk about this at a later meeting, anything that we all want to modify, but the requirements for businesses to provide bicycle parking, new businesses, I think that should be optional. You know, people, it costs a lot to open up a new business, and to require them to put a bike rack, however minimal that money is, I just feel like adding one more burden on someone who's trying to start up a business doesn't seem like it should be a requirement, but that's my opinion. Thank you. I think that's all I have.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Olson?
I wanted to follow up on Commissioner Rankin's, what she just stated there about the bicycle. I raised a similar concern in our, with staff earlier, and you know, I tend to agree. I think we might like to encourage bicycle parking, as you know, especially given our bicycle and pedestrian plan and some of the other initiatives. But you know, I am mindful of the burden on new businesses and concerned about that. So perhaps there's a way we can figure out to address that concern. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. I both comments. I have a feeling this also will fall into that and category where I think there are opportunities to encourage, because there are probably a lot of businesses who would like to have a bicycle rack in front because it means making their facility more amenable to additional patrons. But I also understand that if that's not their view, they shouldn't be required to do it. But there are also a lot of different organizations that are always looking for places to put bike racks in order to further the ease by which people can get around by bicycle and other means of transportation. I have a feeling that this is something that probably can be accomplished without any undue burdens to businesses, but fair question. I think there's enough different considerations here that it'll probably all come out in the wash, but something to keep an eye on.
The next section, Article 8, deals with landscaping and screening. Really 3 categories of changes here. The first encourages, well, it doesn't encourage, got to be careful about what word I choose, would enhance the landscape buffer on, in those areas along parking lots where non-residential uses abut residential uses. And I've got a diagram that I'll show in a second. The second related item is increasing the parking lot landscaped islands by 25%. These work together really to help mitigate the impacts of a parking lot, help to enhance the appearance, really provide some improved survivability for any plantings in those landscaped islands, healthier trees, more shade. And these goals came out of the comprehensive plan as well. Second category here would clarify when and where screening is required, and this really is just an item where staff felt the need for clarification in the zoning ordinance. It's not as clear in the current ordinance as we would like it to be, not just for staff, but for obviously other users who need to pick up the document and try to figure out what our requirements are. So that's really the nature of the changes in 8.040. In 8.060, we're also asking for increased installation sizes for trees going from a 2-inch caliper to 2.5-inch caliper, and a minimum height for shrubs at installation of 18 inches. Right now we don't have a requirement for a shrub height. We are trying to accomplish some things here. Again, survivability, kind of a hardier or improved appearance, and often our goal here is to block some of the headlights when you're parking, and so having a minimum height for shrub and then a maturity height would be helpful. We also provide a good amount of flexibility in this chapter so that we're not demanding certain trees or shrubs or techniques all of the time, so we're pleased to propose a 10-point purpose statement that would help staff as we evaluate landscaping proposals, screening proposals. We didn't want to get overly regulatory here and demand certain types and styles, and this provides that kind of flexibility, but also gives us a chance to review those. With that, I'll move on to the next section unless there are questions.
Questions on Article 8?
Oh, I'm not going to move on to the next section. This is actually my diagram. I forgot about that. This is a plan view showing landscaping between the parking lot, and this is a side view, so you kind of get a sense if the residential was over where Doug is sitting. Those headlights would otherwise be. Those headlights would be blinding, Doug. But with the landscaping at minimum height, that would help to avoid that.
Well, let's talk about shrubbery height. I'm just dying to make a Monty Python reference, but I'm going to resist.
That was pre-1994 as well.
Yes, it was. Some things are timeless.
Article 10 is general development regulations, and really there were only two categories of changes here. They're pretty much in the same category, really, but these were the major changes. And the goal here was really to make them easier to understand and easier to enforce on the village's part. The first category is the lighting regulations. They've been simplified and actually expanded somewhat so that we can deal more effectively with those kinds of glaring lights that are, heading horizontally, I guess. Current ordinance doesn't deal with that well. Future ordinance, if it's adopted, will help us to enforce and deal with those issues. That's something that we wanted to get at. So this is really considered modernization, kind of a best practices set of improvements and clarification. Second category deals with some of those other nuisance issues: noise, smoke, odor. I can't say it now. Odor. There we go. Some of the, again, simplification, make it easier to understand and enforce. This comes out of the comprehensive plan, it's modernization, it's best practices, and just as an example, I'm providing some smoke right there. And then here comes one of the tools that we can use. It's a Ringelmann chart. It's pretty basic, and in the zoning ordinance, anything that exceeds that 20% level would not be allowed, not exceeding, that would be 20% or above, would not be allowed. That would be a violation. So this is much easier to enforce than the other kind of qualitative systems that we have currently in the ordinance. That's it for Article 10.
I have a question. You're probably familiar with that case that you and I had talked to that resident about being close to a car dealership and the lights. So I was reading through the hours of illumination. It says, you know, that they must be reduced to security level no later than 30 minutes after the close of business. Now, are we saying just the lights on the outer edge, or are we saying all of the lights in the parking lot for?
Of course, it depends on the nature of the business, but we are looking at the lights that would be glaring off of the property. So for the most part, in a parking lot situation, you're going to be talking most of the lights there, obviously. But they are allowed security lighting. We want to make sure that we're balancing interests.
Okay, so when you say security lighting, it's lower levels, or it's just like lights on the building?
Well, it can be lower levels.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a case-by-case basis, really. It depends on what we're trying to achieve on any particular site. But the goal here is really to make that interface between conflicting uses a little bit more tolerable.
I just remember the person I was talking to was saying, you know, they were reading it and thinking that all the lights should be off, and you know what I mean?
Right,
there wasn't, it wasn't clear, and that's why I was asking those questions. Okay.
Other questions?
Okay. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Article 11, which is, deals with the issue of nonconformities. I will say it's not an easy topic. It's technically complex. There are a lot of legal subtleties to it, but it's an important article, I think, as Downers Grove moves into the future. And I want to spend a little bit of time with it. So what is a nonconformity? A lot of people commonly refer to this as something that's grandfathered, and that's not exactly right. You know, we like our grandfathers, but nonconformity rules generally want to get rid of them. So ultimately, nonconformities are buildings or uses that are no longer allowed as new in that particular location, or no longer allowed in that size, for example, in that particular location where they now exist. And how do they come about? Well, really, they come about as a consequence of updating or amending almost any ordinance, certainly a complex ordinance like a land use ordinance. You end up creating nonconformities. So there needs to be a better way to deal with them, and we're trying to work our way towards that in some of the changes. So how did we get to this point? In 1965, almost 50 years ago, when the current zoning ordinance was created, Downers Grove was somewhat of a greenfield community. There was lots of room for development. And when you're a greenfield community and you're trying to develop and you want new buildings, one of the things you want to do is you do not want old buildings to survive. This is not just a Downers Grove thing. This is across the board. In the nonconformities chapter that we have, really you could find in many communities across the country. But they are changing, and they're changing for communities like Downers Grove that are now largely built out. So the communities did not want the old buildings to survive. They wanted to make room for new buildings. The rules were made really to encourage demolition of these buildings and to encourage changes of use. But the unintended consequence of all of this was that it really almost reinforced a lack of maintenance of these buildings. I mean, hey, why maintain the building if it's supposed to go away? And what happens if you've got a really successful business in that non-conforming or in that building, and it's a non-conforming business, and it's really maybe not a bad location for now. So these are things that we really wanted to deal with in the new zoning ordinance. So our intention here was to do a number of things. First of all, recognize that in many cases these buildings have local value, that they're worth reinvestment, and that really this is all wrapped in the culture of sustainability. So the ordinance helps to distinguish now, or as proposed would distinguish between illegal businesses and structures as opposed to those that were established legally and are now non-conforming, or the structures were established legally and are now non-conforming. It would place reasonable limits on these uses or structures that are no longer suitable for the district, and it would recognize the interests of landowners and business owners in continuing lawfully established uses. And finally, it would promote reinvestment in these existing structures and encourage their maintenance. So we think that these are all positive changes. Let me give you some examples. And they're all really rooted in the comp plan discussions. There were lots of discussion about nonconformities. One example from 11.030 C and F, it would provide standards. It provides standards to allow expansion of nonconforming uses where there's really no additional external impact to the surrounding uses or the neighborhood. It provides a set of standards that can be followed to award that continuing use. It also would provide standards from 11.040 C. It would provide standards for reasonable expansion of structures, of nonconforming structures. And these often need to occur along the nonconforming building lines, really just extending that line vertically or extending it horizontally has a very minor impact very often, and gosh, it's got to be 10, 15, 20% of the ZBA cases that we've seen over the last few years is this very issue. Everybody's in favor of it, but our ordinance today would require you to build in, to adjust your living space inside your house because it doesn't meet our setbacks, as an example, as opposed to being able to follow that line for a reasonable distance. So this would provide some standards to allow the ZBA to award an expansion of the non-conforming building line, or in some cases, as we've talked about in the procedures section, it might be an administrative ruling. Another example, third example, it would make it easier to rebuild a house, for example, on an existing footprint. That's in 11.040E. And the example that we use, a couple examples that we use, if a house burns down to the ground, has to be built back up, this would allow somebody to use the existing foundation or to use the area of the existing foundation to build upwards, where our current ordinance might force them to have more setback, more side yard setback, and kind of skinny up the house. So they couldn't build basically what they had for the same amount of space. This will allow that kind of change to occur. We had a tornado a couple of years ago, right, kind of skipped through town, and there are examples where the tornado took out a portion of a house that would not be allowed to be built in the same setback area. Under the current ordinance, if there was enough damage to the house, it just flat out could not be rebuilt that way. You would have to skinny up the house or change the design entirely. But here we would allow the homeowner to build up along the same building lines. So we think this would be a positive improvement. And again, this is all in the nonconformity section. We think this is a good change. Any questions about nonconformities before I move on?
Questions from either the audience or the council regarding nonconformities?
Okay. Just a couple left. We've got Article 14 dealing with measurements. A couple key changes here. One is found in 14.100D, and it's something that we're calling contextual setbacks for infill sites. This came out of comprehensive plan discussions, and in the illustration below, you kind of get a sense of what we're talking about. But the example is this. If our zoning ordinance requires a 35-foot front yard setback, 35 feet back from the front property line, and you have a vacant lot and somebody wants to infill that lot. But all of the other houses up and down that block are 25 feet from the setback, not 35 like we're requiring, 25 feet. This would allow the home builder to build at that 25-foot line. If there is an irregular pattern of houses, they could average it. So these are some of the, this is the contextual setback idea, and we think it would really provide a lot of opportunity in some areas where our zoning ordinance just isn't as flexible as we might like to see it. Then at various sections throughout Article 14, we spend some time clarifying setbacks and encroachment opportunities for things like generators, solar structures, solar energy structures, geothermal structures, wind structures, other things like that. And this is really just a need to update and modernize our ordinance, which didn't really conceive of many of these things back in 1965. And the direction to do this really came from council and the comprehensive plan. Those are the major changes in Article 14. Any questions on that?
Questions on measurements from anyone? Measurements, units of measure?
Can I ask one? I'm sorry. I should have asked this ahead of time, but I was just reading it. So in 14.080, there's a change there, and it's talking about lot coverage of lots that are 60 feet wide or less. I just don't understand, and it's not a bad thing probably, I'm just trying to understand what that change is about. It's talking about that detached garages in the rear yard and rear loading attached garages with a building footprint of 500 square feet or less are not counted towards the overall building coverage. And you can get back to me. I guess I just wondered why it was being changed.
Yeah, we'll summarize that and get back to you on it.
Okay. Didn't mean to spring it on you. Sorry about that.
Any other questions?
Last but not least, there are a host of definitions in Article 15. We have moved the definition section from the front of the book to the back, which is a more common placement these days. The definitions have gone through kind of a comprehensive editing, re-editing, cleanup, revision standpoint. In many cases, we're making the definitions either broader or narrower, depending upon what our experience has been over the last several years, what our needs have been. So really, instead of going through and highlighting word after word, if you've got questions about a particular definition over the next couple of weeks, feel free to bring that to our attention, and we'll try to explain any changes. That is what I have tonight. The next steps are another first reading on this topic, on the topic of a proposed zoning ordinance amendment. That would occur in March, or do we have a specific date?
March 4th.
March 4th, so the first Tuesday in March. And at that meeting, we'll highlight some of the changes that we've heard from you and have made during the course of these meetings, and then really open it up for discussion.
Thank you. And just before you leave the definitions or the glossary, I particularly like the hypertext links throughout so that when words come up, you can jump back and forth. I think it also goes to the user-friendliness, interactiveness of the document. So that's also a useful tool. Just wanted to mention that. Next steps have already been described. And as mentioned, some comments have been passed along through the various installments of the presentation over several weeks. And I know that others have been listening carefully and will be sharing thoughts and comments and questions during the open forum, so to speak. So we'll look forward to that in March. But thank you for a very thorough, comprehensive presentation that I think did a terrific job of focusing on the key points and the highlights in a very comprehensible way.
Thank you.
Comprehensible and comprehensive way. Thank you.
That ends our first reading tonight, Mayor. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Brings us to item 10, which is the mayor's report. I have no report tonight. That brings us to item 11 then, the manager's report. Mr. Fielding?
No report tonight, Mayor.
Thank you. Item 12 is reserved for our attorney's report. Mr. Trarka?
Thank you, Mayor. Only one item to present this evening. That's an ordinance amending Chapter 14 to establish reverse commuter parking and amending parking lot provisions. That is all.
Thank you. Next is item 13, council member new business. Do any members of the village council have any items of new business they would like to raise with the rest of the council at this point in time? Hearing none, seeing none, that brings us to item 14. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
Roll call, please.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye, we are adjourned. Thank you and good night.